Today we are going to look at Marantz's new flagship integrated amplifier. It's called the Model 10 and I've had it in 2 different acoustically treated listening rooms since February. And this Marantz amp is such a banger that I've bought the review sample. But I'm getting ahead of myself because in this video I'm going to explain why I think the Model 10 is worth its very, very hefty asking price. And helping me along the way will be 3 side-by-side comparisons, and I'll be referencing music you might read about in Mojo and Hi-Fi News.
This episode is brought to you by the MP200 G3 multi-source player from Germany's T+A. Click the link in the show notes for more information.
At 34 kilograms, the Model 10 from Marantz is my first exposure to an amplifier that I'd call a 2-man lift. And in Lisbon, I had to park an IKEA Bagboda shelf in favour of a proper hi-fi rack from Italy's Solid Steel. Now, why is the Model 10 so gosh darn heavy? Well, Marantz says the chassis is made from 3 layers of metal, so we've got aluminium, steel and copper. And the copper shielding is apparently used to block resonances and electrical noise. And inside that chassis sit numerous multi-layer PCBs that are housed in isolated sub-enclosures. So perhaps this extensive use of internal compartmentalization is why the Model 10 sells for 14,500 euros. Or maybe it's because the build quality here is flawless. Now, on output power, the Model 10 promises 250 watts per channel into 8 ohms, and into 4 ohms, we get a redonkulous 500 watts per channel. And I connected the Model 10 to a pair of Kaya 90 floor standers from Vivid Audio and initially used the Link 10 from Marantz as a streaming source. And then I later switched to the Eversolo DMP A8 because the Link N10 had to go back to Marantz because it was sent to me in error. That said, I'll have a few things to say about my short time with the Link 10N in a separate video. And in Lisbon, I enlisted the help of a neighbour to get the Model 10 up the stairs and into the hi-fi rack. And he agreed to help because he's a nice chap and because he also wanted to hear the Marantz into the Vivids. And of course, I was happy to oblige. And I punched in the latest dub techno EP from SND and RTN, or Send and Return, and my neighbour's chin, it hit the floor. He said, "I have never heard anything like that in my entire life." And neither had I, to be honest, but my reference points were different from his because I had just swapped out the NAD M66 and M23 for the Model 10. And I'll say more about that in a moment. But my neighbour runs a pair of Dali Oberon 3 stand mounts powered by a WIM amp back at his house. Now that is a very capable system for the money, but even the short, sharp shock of a first impression tell us that the Kaya 90 driven by the Model 10 offers sound quality that's light years ahead of the WIM and the Dali. And it also reminds us of the importance of first-hand listening experience, because before I hit play on that SND and RTN or Send and Return EP, my neighbour was asking me, he was saying things like, well, but how much better could it be than what I have at home? And now he knows. And what my neighbour heard for an hour and then me for a week was epic scale and separation, as evidenced later when I was listening on my own by Deadbeat's reworks of Robert Palmer's, well, not his catalogue, but some selected songs. And on Lowe's Time is the Diamond, I heard ample space painted into the soundstage depth. And I hadn't heard that so much from the NAD pairing. But it took me longer to notice the above average sub-bass dynamics generated by the Model 10. And it only really clicked when I played, what was it? I think it was Left Field's Afro Left EP. Now this amp punches harder in the bottom octaves, so 20 to 40 hertz, than any amp that I've heard to date. And it manages this at lower volume levels to make late night listening to something like Peter Gabriel's I.O. far more satisfying at those lower levels. Now we might reasonably ask, how does the Model 10 do this? Now I can't know for sure, but I think it might be because the volume control is gain staged. But of course, if you're only running small stand mounts or larger two-ways that are high pass filtered for a sub, you're unlikely to hear any change to your system's sub bass kick. Now here in Berlin, and compared to the Technics SU-R1000 that we reviewed recently, the Marantz polishes the uppermost treble and paints music's tone colors with richer oils. And these qualities then mix with the easefulness of the Grimm MU2 for what we might call a next level listening experience. YouTube is obsessed with describing things as being next level, and I just said that, sorry. But therein lies a catch, because pair the Model 10 with a lesser quality streaming DAC like the Wim Ultra or the Eversolo DMP A6, and you might misjudge the Marantz as a weaker than expected performer. And if you did this, you'd miss out on its filigreed handling of Monolake's synthetic percussive ticks and rim shots. Or rather, you'd miss out on the streaming DAC's filigreed handling of those percussive ticks and rim shots. Because at this level, source quality matters hugely. Now, I have 3 terabytes of FLAC files stored on a Grimm MU2 here in Berlin. That's what I call my Roon server. But in Lisbon, that same 3 terabytes of FLACs sits on the SSD inside a Roon Nucleus One. Now that's a dedicated Roon server into which I have also plugged my Tidal login credentials. Now this allows me to stream any of my FLAC files or those stored on Tidal servers to anywhere in my home. So in the lounge room of late, that's been the Marantz Link N10 and the Eversolo DMP A8. And they are both what's called Roon ready, which means they can receive Roon streams and they give us all of the advanced functionality that Roon-Raht's streaming protocol gives us. Now upstairs in my main office system, I have Roon ready streamers from iFi and Wim. And I also have a pair of KEF LSX on my desk. And I can send Roon streams to any of those devices as well. But I can also have Roon stream to Apple AirPlay devices, Chromecast devices, and Sonos devices. And I would like to thank Roon for sponsoring this video. So only with the Grimm MU2, the Mola Mola Tambaki, or the Eversolo DMP A10 did the Model 10 convincingly step ahead of the Technics SU-R1000. And the Technics requires no outboard DA converter because it is a digitally fed switching amplifier, and the Marantz is an analog fed switching amplifier. But make no mistake, the Technics is the best value of these two amps because it doesn't force us to pony up for a high-end streaming DAC. Now we'll come back to the SU-R1000 shortly, but don't be fooled by the Marantz's weight. The Model 10 is a Class D amplifier whose output stage was co-developed with Purify. Now it's a dual amplifier module where each channel is fed by a custom switch mode power supply, and Marantz is very keen to point out that the Model 10's amp stage is a custom design and not the Purify Eigentakt module found in NAD amplifiers. And this brings us neatly to our first proper side-by-side comparison. So in Lisbon, I put the Model 10 next to NAD's M66 and the Eigentakt loaded M23 power amp, which together sell for, I think, just over 10 grand, 10,000 euros that is. And the NAD system gives us everything we could possibly want on top of loudspeaker drive. That's because the M66 preamp internalizes a streaming DAC, MM and MC phono, and room correction with subwoofer integration. And the Marantz is an integrated amplifier with an MM and MC phono input as its only bonus feature. Now for this side-by-side, I first used the Link 10N as a streaming DAC into each amplifier system's balanced analog input, and then later I used the streaming DAC output of the M66 to feed the Model 10. And the audible differences between these two amp systems were not close. With Chris Isaac's wicked game, the Marantz isn't as thin or as ectomorphic sounding as the NAD pre-power combo. We might say that the Marantz sounds more corpulent than the NAD Tufa. And playing Can's Future Days, we hear the Model 10 as the slightly warmer of the two, especially in the uppermost treble. The twin NAD rig shows, I think, hints of brittleness when we push the volume harder on New Order's True Faith Remix 12-inch. And we don't hear this from the Marantz. Now perhaps the Marantz wins out so convincingly here because not only is it truly balanced from input to output, but it uses the latest iteration of Marantz's HDAMs. Those are modules made from discrete components whose work would otherwise be done by op-amps. Or perhaps it's because each of the Model 10's analog inputs is powered by a linear power supply and not a switcher. And this is why we see a potted toroidal transformer through the top mesh. It juices each of the Model 10's analog inputs and the volume attenuation. And it's through that top mesh that the Model 10's internal illumination glows, because the Marantz is a beautiful nighttime amplifier. It looks amazing in the room at night. Far more so than the very plain Jane looking Hegel H590 that I also have in Portugal. Now the Hegel is a class AB amplifier offering 300 watts per channel into 8 ohms. That's slightly more power than the Marantz, but the Hegel houses a streaming DAC instead of the Marantz's phono stage. Now the Marantz and the Hegel are reasonably well matched on overall bass bulk and forward heft. And watching TV and movies, I noted again the Model 10's more dynamic sub-bass. Now further north in the frequency range, the Japanese-made amplifier isn't quite as rich in the mid-bass or is seemingly rolled off at the very top as its Norwegian rival, although I don't think Hegel amps are made in Norway. In other words, the Model 10's treble extension is more overt and cleaner sounding than the Hegel's. And this benefits the ambient techno of A Positive Life more than it does the horror's indie krautrocking C within a C. But not all rock recordings get dinged, because the Marantz's superior cleanliness with transient incision enhances My Morning Jacket's Country Fried Americana just beautifully. And superior transient incision is what I hear when comparing the Marantz Model 10 to the Technics SU-R1000. So yes, this is our third side-by-side comparison for today. So the Marantz's digital VU meters might not be as impressive as Technics's analog dials, but they're a darn sight nicer to look at than Eversolos or Wims. And the top and front plate illumination, the extra weight, and the less brutalist industrial design let us see and feel where the extra money goes when we opt for the Marantz. But the Technics does have one key advantage over the Marantz, and that's its phono stage and the DSP-based cartridge correction, which makes vinyl records sound better organized than they do via Marantz's all-analog phono input. And it's also worth noting that the Technics has a balanced phono input and the Marantz doesn't. But the Technics doesn't quite deliver the microdynamic excitement of the Marantz's phono input. So the Model 10 more effectively translates music's rhythmic drive from the groove to the speaker, even if it doesn't sound as well separated and tidy and organized as the Technics does. And these audible differences seem to carry over to each amplifier's headphone socket. So I would pair the mellower Meze 105 AER with the sprightlier sounding Marantz, and then the livelier sounding Meze 109 Pro with the Technics. I want to raise another point here because we're often told that Class D amps are better for our electricity bills because they draw less power from the wall. Now, according to Google, the Model 10 pulls 270 watts during typical operation and 0.1 watt in standby mode. Now that's only slightly less than the Luxman L505Z's 330 watts, but that's a Class AB amplifier. But also the Marantz's power draw is more than the Technics' 220 watts. Now perhaps this is why the Model 10 runs warmer than the Technics. I don't know, I'm not an engineer, I'm just guessing here. However, the Model 10's defeatable auto power off feature ensures that it won't burn power and my money whilst I sleep. Many years ago, it used to be a cliche to say that Class D amps sound emotionally distant. But nowadays, it's a cliche to say how far they've come. And it's true, they have come a long way, and some have done so without trying to sound like the tried and trusted Class AB designs preferred by the classist faithful. And to my ears, the Marantz blends the best qualities of the Hegel H590 and the NAD M23, so the Hegel's heft and the NAD's layer separation. But crucially, the Model 10 ditches the Hegel's more rounded sound and the M23's crisper but leaner tonality. And I think the Technics comes closest of all to the Marantz, but its tonal colours aren't as vibrant as the Marantz's. And that's why I think the Marantz Model 10 is the best sounding amplifier I have heard to date. Now, whilst it's true that you don't need to spend a lot of money to get great sound, truly great hi-fi gear like the Model 10 makes it more enjoyable. So in that sense, you do get what you pay for and you don't get what you don't pay for, even though we have to factor in diminishing marginal returns. But better gear like the Model 10 has a more interesting side effect. It makes it less of a punishment to listen to music you don't like. So the Model 10 is never going to make me a Chili Peppers fan, nothing could to be honest, but it has afforded me a fresh appreciation of Frank Sinatra. But John, the Marantz is so heavy and so expensive. Yeah, it is. But as Kiwis and Aussies love to say, go big or go home. Anyway, that's all from me for today. If you like what you saw or heard, please consider subscribing to the channel. And if you didn't like what you saw or heard, I thank you for watching this far anyway. And if you want more music recommendations, you can find those on my Patreon's free tier now, so it needn't cost you a dime. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. Let's round out this video with some additional thoughts on my review process for the Marantz Model 10. So firstly, you might be wondering why I had two different color Model 10s in Lisbon. Well, that's because I had to make two separate trips out there this year, and I didn't think it was fair to Marantz to have the amplifier sitting in Lisbon whilst I was back here in Berlin. So they sent me a champagne finish for my first trip and a black one for my second. So you might also wonder why I didn't connect the Model 10 to the other speakers that I have in Lisbon. Well, the Klipsch Forte 4, for all their dynamic excitement, I think impart too strong a personality of their own to be used as review speakers, unless we're talking low-powered tube amps. And I couldn't review the big boy Marantz with the Wharfedale Linton or the Kef Q Concerto Meta, not because they're too cheap, but because they do not resolve the differences between high-end amplifiers as cleanly as the Vivid Kaya 90. And you might also be wondering why I didn't compare the Model 10 to the Hegel H600. Now that's an easy one to answer. I don't have a Hegel H600. And the same goes for the Mark II M23 from NAD. I don't have one of those either.